Slaanesh and his sexy minions don't mess around in Warhammer 3 with one of the fastest, most aggressive armies going. In this guide, we're going to learn how to wield this army effectively, starting off in this video by going through the roster and all the units, making sure we understand what they're capable of, and in the second part we'll look at the strategy, tactics, and how to use said army all together. So let us begin then with the good old... First up on the scales and leader of Slaanesh's army, the legendary lord, N'Kari. Listed as a wizard, but he's much more than that, as he is really the embodiment of the Slaanesh army and how they work. That is, a glass cannon. He can do a lot of damage, massive weapon strength, armor piercing, lots of melee attack, charge bonus as well, but he only has 5 armor. Does have a fair bit of melee defense though, so he can look after himself in the melee, but with only 5 armor, he is going to be gunned down pretty quick by missiles and artillery if he's not careful. With a whopping 100 speed though, even if he is getting shot at by missiles, he can get after them very quickly or get out of there away from them very quickly. For his spells and abilities, he's got Willing Prey, a reduction to melee attack and melee defense, very useful for when he's fighting anything, but maybe more specifically single entities. And the same with the Wit Stealer Sword, which boosts his damage by 100%, which means yes, he gets over 1000 damage. Utterly disgusting. He also has the Lore of Slaanesh, so has all the spells available there, and overall the Lore of Slaanesh is a very damage-centric lorebook. It's all about doing damage to the enemy and not so much keeping your troops alive or anything like that, lending more to the fact that N'Kari is pure damage dealer. He also has Devastating Flanker, which you'll see throughout this army a lot, most units have it. It doubles charge bonus when attacking enemies in the flank or rear. So just like our Lord and Saviour, Ron Jeremy, you'll be great at hitting things from the back. Then we have Soul Siphon. This will cause damage to combatants like a Mortis Engine effect around him, but it only affects wavering or routed units, so a nice passive to push units over the edge. Blissful Rapture, melee attack and leadership to the entire army when N'Kari casts a spell. He also has Arcane Conduit for the magic recharge. Harvester of Souls, when an enemy unit is destroyed within 30 meters, it will actually heal N'Kari. Destroyed probably meaning that the unit needs to be completely wiped out though, so it might not be as easy as it sounds unless it's maybe against demons. Also has a physical resistance, causes terror, and is a demon so won't rout and run away. Overall, N'Kari is the master of pain, a massive damage dealer who can likely take out just about anything, infantry, cavalry monsters. A solid assassin as well with that Wit Stealer Sword plus 100% damage is pretty crazy, not to mention all his other damage boosting abilities, spells and things. He is an absolute murderer, but beware that 5 armor, like I say, missiles and artillery might take him down. He doesn't have a missile resistance. He does have the physical resistance, which will help him a little bit, but not that much. Then we have a generic lord, the Exalted Keeper of Secrets. This one of the Shadow Lorebook. There is a Slaanesh version as well. Stats-wise, very similar to N'Kari, just not quite as strong, but still a big damage dealer. Still not a lot of armor though. This one does have a shield, however, so it can protect him from missiles a little bit better. And this one is anti-large, being his main selling point, so good for taking on those other lords, cavalry monsters. For his abilities, he has Seductive Glory, makes all nearby units go into rampage and lose melee defense, so helping damage them. Ballet of Blows, this will increase his damage every 15 seconds, which means he can do very well in prolonged combat for about a minute. Then you'll probably want to cycle charge him. Got the Lore of Shadows, obviously, so Pit of Shades, Pendulum, the Withering, all those great spells he has the option of taking. Again, another pretty damage-centric lorebook. Then we've got a few more usual bits. Strider, Devastating Flanker again, so good when you use him on the flank. Smoke and Mirrors, standard for the Shadow lorebook when he's casting, plus 10 speed to everybody, so that could be good when you're moving up. Glamour of Slaanesh, minus 5 melee attack to every unit around him within 35 meters. Soul Siphon again, the same as what N'Kari has. Direct damage to wavering units. And then we have Feasting on Fear. This will give healing to the Lord when enemy units are wavering around him. So similar to that N'Kari ability, but maybe a little bit easier to actually make it happen rather than having to destroy units. Arcane Conduit there as well, physical resistance, terror, demon. So very similar setup to N'Kari overall, just big damage dealer, glass cannon, a little bit squishy with that 5 armor. Does have a little more protection with the shield, some nice abilities. Of course, the Lore of Shadows is always nice, or the Lore of Slaanesh if you prefer. But really, probably the Lord choice you'll bring if you're looking for an anti-large Lord specifically, although N'Kari isn't going to be bad at that. This one is a little more built for it. And your last Lord of choice, the Herald of Slaanesh, again with the Slaanesh or Shadows lorebook. She is again a damage dealer, much like everything else in this army, but not quite as much as the other two lords, of course. Still pretty good though, with armor-piercing weapon strength, lots of melee attack. Still lacking in the armor, of course. Nice charge bonus. Can be put on a bunch of different mounts, which is probably where she'll want to be with that lacking armor, because she'll be a bit vulnerable otherwise. Those mounts being a steed, which can make her very fast at 100 speed, or two types of chariots, the Seeker Chariot or the Exalted Seeker Chariot. Pretty much the same deal, just the Exalted one is a bit better. Still makes her very fast and a chariot damage dealer. For spells and abilities, she has Locus of Grace, a melee defense and physical resistance boost to an area, so you can protect some troops with that. Portal Glyph, so you can summon some Furies, that's always nice to have. Then the Lore of Slaanesh in this case, or the Lore of Shadows, both very damage-focused lore books. So despite being the lesser of the lords, she still has that magical potential for damage. Devastating Flanker on there, all the other generic abilities. And then some of the same stuff we've seen, Soul Siphon, Blissful Rapture, Arcane Conduit, Physical Resistance, although only Fear, not Terror this time, but still useful, and is a demon of course. So likely the Lord of Choice only really if you want to save some money, because they're all pretty much doing the same thing. They're all just big damage dealers in one way or another. The Herald is maybe a little more strictly anti-infantry with the chariots and things, but either way they're all very mobile, they can all do a lot of damage. The only real downside to the larger ones is that they're very squishy to missiles, so she has the advantage of being a little bit smaller even on her mounts, but either way all strong damage dealer lords. Now let's move on. Guess what? It's pretty much the same deal again with the heroes. The LRS of Slaanesh or Shadows, she is very similar to the Herald, just slightly lesser in the stats, but the same idea. Damage dealer, comes with some magic, has the same 3 mounts as well. Ability-wise, she's exactly the same as the Herald, except instead of having Locus of Grace, she has Locus of Swiftness, which increases charge damage and speed for an area. Honestly, it's hard to think of a unique reason to bring one of these, given that the 3 lords all do exactly the same thing pretty much. They're damage dealers, they have magic. Maybe if you wanted to bring some alternate spells, if you've got the Slaanesh Lorebook Lord, you want the Shadows Lorebook for a few spells, you bring one of these. Or maybe you're looking to goon up on an enemy lord or something, maybe you want 1 or 2 of these, but otherwise, maybe just a good disruptor on that fast mount or something. And then we have the Cultist of Slaanesh, who might look like a mighty damage dealer, but is actually a little more defensive with more melee defense than melee attack. No armor-piercing weapon strength, although a bonus versus infantry, so better being a crowd fighter against lighter armored stuff. She can summon a unit of Demonettes, which is nice. She has Slippery to help her survive Deadly Onslaught for some damage, another ability that can reduce enemy damage output to help keep her safe, so perhaps a bit more of a support hero, but still fairly damage dealer, albeit more of the lighter, lower-end enemies. And please put her on a steed mount because she doesn't have any shoes. Now to the main part of this Slaanesh army. First up, the Marauders of Slaanesh. These are your cheap chaffy type unit. Their stats are nothing to write home about, but they do have a bonus versus infantry, so they can do okay against other low-tier infantry. They do have a shield as well, so they can absorb some missiles and survive a little better. But this is just really an early game unit or a cheap unit that you're going to use to kind of spam and just bog the enemy down with. They don't have much melee defense, leadership, or armor, so they're not going to last terribly long or do a terribly great deal. Handy though if you just want to plonk something cheap on the front line so that you can spend more money on the more important parts of your army. And then there is the Hellscourges version, which is basically the same unit except they have a whip, which gives them far greater melee defense, I guess because they don't need to be so close, which means this unit can survive and hold a little bit better than the previous sword version, but won't do as much damage. So, ultimately, if you want to try and hurt the enemy front line better, use the sword version. If you want to try and help your front line survive longer, use the Hellscourges version. Better if you want to buy time for your flanking units, although don't expect them to last too long because still, crappy armor and leadership. And there is one more version of the Marauders of Slaanesh, the Spear version, which are obviously anti-large, so gonna be a better defender of your flanks, protecting from any cavalry and things trying to get behind you with that anti-large bonus. They're gonna be the ones to try and take them on, or they could be a frontline if you're expecting a lot of large, say against the ogres. These will probably be the choice rather than the other 2 types of Marauder, even though they're still probably not going to do great against ogres, but still, they are the anti-large version, the anti-large choice. Come with charge reflection and charge defense, so that can help them do a little more damage and survive better as well. Then on to one of your prime damage dealers on foot, the Demonettes of Slaanesh. These are your damage dealer infantry. They have good armor-piercing weapon strength, nice melee attack, which has magical attacks as well. They're very fast on their feet with 54 speed, which means they are good for flanking, and especially as they have that devastating flanker ability, which doubles their charge bonus on rear and side attacks. They could be just a straight-up charging front line, but they won't get to use devastating flanker that way, so you could use marauders for that job, and then have these on the flank ready to move around quickly to hit enemies from the back. Be warned though, with only 5 armor, they are going to be absolutely blasted down by missiles if they're not careful. They will get torn up pretty quick by cav charges and monsters as well. So a massive glass cannon, they can do a lot of damage, but they might just die quick. And the same is true of Exalted Demonettes. Pretty much the same deal, just better at the job. Still very fast, still very damage dealer, still very armor piercing. They do have a few extras though. You can see a little symbol on their melee attack that is charmed, which reduces enemy melee attack, so whoever they're fighting will have their melee attack reduced by 8, helping the Demonettes survive better. They also have Soul Scent, which will increase their damage when they're nearby a routing unit, and that will scale with the more routing units that happen to be nearby. So overall, just an absolute savage of a damage dealer. They could be a really strong front line, even though they're not using devastating flanker. They're still going to be so deadly on that front line, let alone if they flank something and get that devastating flanker bonus as well. But alas, missiles, artillery, and magic spells as well could hurt them pretty badly with only 15 armor, so there's that risk that they may get killed before they can really do anything. Such is the life of a glass cannon. But be careful with them, and they can serve you very well. Now, if you thought Demonettes were fast, let's take a look at some. First of all, a sort of flying cavalry, the Chaos Furies. As with the other Chaos armies, these are very fast units, good for harassing missiles and artillery, stopping them from firing. They do have armor-piercing damage, these ones, so they can do some work. Even though they only have 18 melee defense and 20 armor, they can still put out a bit of damage before they go. The Furies for the Slaanesh army, though, are a little bit more essential than other Chaos factions because of the lack of armor throughout the army. Missiles and artillery are going to be very dangerous to your more powerful and expensive units. These Furies can get all over those missiles and artilleries to prevent them from doing damage to your army, buying it time to move up and close the gap. But closing the gap doesn't take long with Slaanesh's army, especially as Cavs like this have 100 freaking speed. So they are all incredibly fast. These are the Hellstriders with Hell Scourges, so a whip version, slightly better melee defense. They're classed as a melee cavalry, which means they can charge into melee and stay there and fight for a bit, instead of having to cycle charge due to low melee defense like shock cavalry. So a cavalry that could flank if it wants to, or just charge straight into the front line. As it doesn't have devastating flanker, it doesn't have to worry about wasting that. It does have an ability though called Soul Hunter, which will give it a damage resistance, more charge bonus, and more leadership for every kill it makes. It also has poison attacks, which is going to help it survive better, which a shield will help too, and it has Vanguard deployment, so it can be pretty sneaky. Overall, a fairly versatile melee cav. And then there is another version of Hellstriders, this one coming with a spear though, making them an anti-large cavalry. Still got the poison, still got the Soul Hunter ability, still got Vanguard deployment, so pretty much the same deal. But instead of targeting infantry like the Hell Scourges, you'll be going after the large stuff, maybe perhaps cavalry, depending if it's heavily armored. Maybe you might not want to because you don't have armor piercing. Or you could get after monstrous infantry, maybe even single entity monsters, but these are your anti-large killer. Although with only 15 armor and 24 melee defense, they are not super tough, so ideally you don't want to leave them in combat too long. Try to cycle charge these a bit more. Should have no problem taking out lesser armored cavalry though, perhaps skirmish cav and things like that. Maybe chariots as well. As they do have that 100 speed, they will be able to catch most stuff. And then we have the Seekers of Slaanesh. So these are kind of similar, but overall more powerful. They have a Demonette on top, so they have armor-piercing damage, lots of melee attack, good melee defense as well, bit of a charge bonus, still very fast, still lacking in the armor though. However, these more importantly do have devastating flanker, which means you really want to try and flank behind the enemy, hit them in the back and sides, and these will do an absolute ton of damage. They have Vanguard deployment as well, physical resistance fear, so they can be absolute destroyers from the back and sides. Where the first cav with the Hell Scourges is kind of more of the survivor holding cav, and then you've got the anti-large spear version. These ones are the pure damage dealer version that are all about that flanking ideally. And then we have the Heart Seekers. Pretty much the same thing, but they've got Exalted Demonettes on top, so better stats all around, more damage output, a little more armor. They do have devastating flanker and Vanguard deployment, so again, much like the previous cavalry, look for that flanking primarily. They do have Soul Scent as well, like the normal Exalted Demonettes. That was the ability that makes them do more damage when wavering or routing units are nearby them. So overall, pretty much the same unit as the previous one, as the Seekers, except these are just better at the job. So if you want to build an army for the ultimate Hammer and Anvil game plan, bring the Heart Seekers for maximum damage potential. Onto the chariots then, with the Seeker Chariot. First of all, it is pretty much just your standard chariot, to be honest, not too much special to say. Charge it around, try to keep it moving, don't leave it in prolonged melee combat too long as it doesn't have great melee defense. Charge it through infantry primarily, it has armor piercing and a bonus versus infantry, has devastating flanker as well, so try to hit things in the back. These chariots are very mass heavy, so difficult to stop for the enemy, great for disrupting missiles and just charging straight through the front line into the back line and things like that. Especially with that 100 speed, they can just be absolute nightmares. And then we have the Hellflayers, basically the same as the previous unit, the Seeker Chariots, just better at the job because there's an Exalted Demonette on top, comes with the same stuff, devastating flanker, has Soul Scent because it's an Exalted Demonette this time, but otherwise basically the same thing, honestly, just slightly better. So use it as you would any other chariot, charge it around, keep it moving, try not to leave it in prolonged combat. It has a little bit more health than the previous unit, so it'll survive a little bit better, but otherwise, it's a chariot. What do you want? And lastly, we have the Exalted Seeker Chariot, which, guess what, is basically the same again, except this one is only a single entity. Rather than having 4 in the unit like the Seekers and Hellflayer, this one is a solo unit, which makes it a little bit easier to whiz around by itself. You don't have to worry about one of your chariots getting stuck and then the other 3 coming back to try and help it sort of thing. So that's nice. Otherwise, just more damage output, big weapon strength, armor piercing, anti-infantry, big charge bonus. You know the drill. Devastating flanker as well. Does have perfect vigor this one, so it doesn't get tired, meaning its damage output will stay higher the whole way through the battle. But ultimately, still just a chariot. Whichever one of these 3 different types of chariot you choose, or whether it's a lord on a chariot, they all do pretty much the same thing. Charge them around, don't leave them in melee, charge them through infantry. You get the idea. Let's finish up then with the big boys. No Chaos Army would be complete without the obligatory Chaos Spawn, so here's the Slaanesh version. Pretty much the same as every other Chaos Spawn in the world. It's unbreakable, so it'll fight to the ends of the earth. It has good weapon strength, but no armor-piercing damage, so good at taking on lighter infantry, good at maybe holding a line a little bit. It doesn't have a ton of armor. Not too bad melee defense on these ones, though. Does have devastating flanker, however, so can be good for flanking around, getting that double charge bonus. That'll help it out. But otherwise, just a good nuisance unit for the enemy that's hard to get rid of, without the right tools anyway. And then to another monstrous infantry, the Fiends of Slaanesh. These are a monstrous infantry that are probably more of a shock cavalry really, because they don't have the best melee attack in the world at only 36, but they do have a fairly big charge bonus at 38. Seems like they're going to benefit from charging in and out to get that charge bonus. They have nice armor-piercing weapon strength and devastating flanker, so again, they want to be a flanking unit, primarily on infantry I would say, but with that nice armor-piercing damage, they could go after cavalry and things as well. Of course, they have good speed at 95, and they have a little ability on their melee attack called Sulfuric Musk, which reduces enemy melee attack and melee defense by 5. So, while a monstrous infantry, they're basically like having another cavalry, to be honest. And then we have a big old monster in the Keeper of Secrets. The same as the Lord type, it's a big massive monster. You can't really tell when it's not stood next to anything, but if you look at the start of this video, you can see how big N'Kari is compared to normal human-sized things, and they're pretty huge. So, big old single entity monster. Honestly, it's pretty much the same as the Lord version, except it doesn't have choosable spells, but it does have 2 bound spells. The Lash of Slaanesh, which is a breath attack, and Acquiescence, which reduces enemy melee attack and speed. So, useful to bring along if you want a big damage dealer monster and you don't have one as your Lord, or maybe you want 2, then you can bring a Keeper of Secrets unit. With that big old 80 speed as well, they can be a very difficult monster to get a hold of and to stop charging around. And finally, our last big boy, the Soul Grinder of Slaanesh, which is a pure melee Soul Grinder and is anti-large. So just a big damage dealer, has devastating flanker as well if you can manage it. He is pretty quick, which he is going to need to catch the kind of targets he's going to be going for, the large stuff. Other single entity monsters, cavalry, monstrous infantry, lords and heroes on mounts, that's who this Soul Grinder wants to crunch down. So if you're facing a particularly large heavy army, one of these is going to be essential really, as there isn't a great deal of anti-large choices for the Slaanesh army, and as they don't really have, or they have no missiles actually, large units could be a bit of an issue for them. They do have that anti-large cav and the anti-large infantry, but those aren't going to be the toughest in the world. The soul grinder is going to be your big tough anti-large boy. So there we go. Speed, aggression, and hitting hard from the back. No, it's not the night I spent with your mum, it's just the Slaanesh army. Don't let that put you off. This is a very strong army, very fast, going to be quite micro-intensive because of the speed, but a fun one all the same. In part 2 of this guide, we'll look at the tactics, strategies, and how to properly hit things from the back. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.